These were the recommendations and observations given to the president in 1943. The president sent a second close confidant by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Harold Hoskins to the Middle East in 1943 as well. This was a grand 3-month tour that he embarked all the way from Morocco to Iran and every country in between. And the focus of this fact-finding mission was, again, Palestine as well. What Hoskins found on his trip in 1943 was, quote, Arab feelings remain uncompromisingly against the acceptance of a political Zionist state in Palestine. It should be very clear to the American people, therefore, that only by military force can a Zionist state in Palestine be imposed on the Arabs. To establish a Jewish political state in Palestine, Hoskins said, was, quote, an extremely controversial proposal. So these were the recommendations and the observations that FDR faced when he sent out these 2 missions to Palestine and to the broader Middle East in the middle of World War II. Now, why do I bring these up as a prelude to talking about what's taking place today? I bring them up because it shows quite demonstrably and clearly that the United States understood full well that the Zionist plan was to control and dominate all of historic Palestine and to engage in a process of transferring or ethnically cleansing its indigenous inhabitants. It also understood full well that Palestinians understood that this was the goal of the Zionist movement and were obviously opposed to it. And furthermore, that the United States understood that the idea of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine could only be done through military means. All of this was known to the United States in 1943, 4 years before the agreement of the United States to partition Palestine. So what happened with these recommendations that were given to FDR? Well, from his perspective, nothing. He had more important issues on his plate in the midst of the Second World War. Palestine was relegated to the back burner, and he died in 1945 before the issue came to a head, obviously succeeded by President Truman afterward. And so we're all familiar, as I mentioned at the outset, with the extremely effective Zionist campaign to pressure Truman to agree to the partition of Palestine and to the establishment of a Jewish state. But what was very interesting, and I just wrote about this, it was published yesterday in Electronic Intifada, was that there was a top secret memo written by the State Department in June of 1947. This was just a few months before the United States reversed itself and supported the notion of partitioning Palestine into 2 states. This top secret memo, written by a fellow of the name of Lloyd Henderson, he was the director of the Office of Near Eastern Affairs of the State Department at the time. He wrote in this memo, quote, Palestine should become neither an Arab nor a Jewish state, but a single independent Palestinian state in which all its people, of whatever religion or blood, may dwell together in concord. All the inhabitants of Palestine should accept the responsibilities and share the rights and privileges of a common Palestinian citizenship. The government of Palestine should represent all Palestinian citizens and should protect their human rights and fundamental freedoms. Henderson then went on to outline how this government of Palestine would work. He called for a constitution and a Bill of Rights. And what was very interesting, especially when you consider at the time Lebanon had just got its independence and it had formed a polity that was based on confession, based on religion, with governmental seats apportioned to people from different religious communities. This turned out to work not so well for Lebanon. And what was interesting about this memo in the case of Palestine was that it actually called for a non-confessional state. It called for a federal state that would be made up of different divisions, not based on people's religion, but based on their economic and social status. Furthermore, this plan called for the establishment of secular legal codes to govern the state of Palestine and non-discriminatory immigration and land use, obviously things that were done in a much different fashion when the State of Israel was established in 1948. So what's the point of looking back 70 and 74 years at these long forgotten memos and policy recommendations that are in the archives of the State Department? And by the way, all of this is on the internet. I didn't do any secret research to find these documents. It's all there. The reason why I draw your attention to these policy recommendations and memos is because when they were written 75 and 70 years ago today, they bear extreme relevance to the situation that Palestinians and Israelis find themselves in today. 2017, for sure, is going to be a turning point in the history of Palestine, in the history of Israeli-Palestinian relations, because for the past 70 years, the entire paradigm of the international community for resolving the Israeli-Palestinian issue, of trying to reconcile the claims of the Zionist movement with those of the indigenous inhabitants of Palestine, has rested on the assumption of partitioning Palestine into two states. This was the idea behind the UN Partition Plan of 1947. It was the implicit idea behind UN Resolution 242, which was adopted in 1967 after that war. And it was explicit after the PLO adopted a two-state framework in 1988 in its Declaration of Independence, and became even more explicit when, as Amin mentions, Israel and PLO entered into the so-called peace process now more than 20 years ago. But we've had 70 years of trying to resolve this issue through the two-state paradigm of dividing Palestine into two. And we've also, this year, are marking the 50th anniversary of Israel's military occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. That 22% of historic Palestine that was not conquered by Israel in 1948. And by the way, the UN only recommended, and by the way, it was only a General Assembly recommendation. It was not a UN Security Council resolution that called for the partition of Palestine. But even this recommendation only called for Israel to have 55% of the land, with Palestinians having 45% of the land. And Israel went on, of course, during the Nakba in 1948 to conquer areas and territories well beyond that envisioned by the United Nations in its partition plan. But as we approach the 50th anniversary of Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and as we approach the 70-year anniversary of the partition plan, and by the way, as we approach this year as well, the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, promising on behalf of the Zionist movement to establish a Jewish national home in Palestine, we have all of these anniversaries coming together in what I believe is a perfect storm to begin to rethink and reconceptualize how to finally resolve this issue fairly, justly, now that a two-state resolution looks increasingly improbable, if not impossible. Now, why do I say that the two-state resolution is looking improbable, if not impossible? And yes, I recognize that the PLO still supports the establishment of an independent Palestinian state next to Israel, and I'm not here to question that decision. But the reality on the ground has made it so that Israel has made it quite clear that it is never going to allow for the establishment of a Palestinian state. Think back to 2015, the last time that Benjamin Netanyahu won re-election as Israeli Prime Minister. And by the way, this year will mark him surpassing David Ben-Gurion as the Israeli prime minister who has served the longest period of time. His 2015 victory was predicated on a statement he made to the Israeli electorate 1 or 2 days before the election, saying that under his watch there would never be a Palestinian state. And yes, it's true that Netanyahu is now facing 4 separate corruption scandals in Israel, any one of which might bring him down and possibly put him in jail. But this is beside the point, because what comes after Netanyahu is more right-wing than Netanyahu, not less. And, I mean, Netanyahu is a liberal in his governmental coalition. He is at the top of a coalition which is hardcore right. And you can see a clear acknowledgement of what the so-called peace process was all about just a few weeks ago when Netanyahu said, okay, maybe I won't agree to a state, but what I'll agree to is what I will call a state minus. And everyone took Netanyahu to task for saying, how can you say such a thing? It has to be a real state. But Netanyahu was only telling the truth. He was only telling the truth of the basis upon which rested all the United States and Israeli proposals for a so-called Palestinian state. From Bill Clinton's time in office in the 1990s up through Barack Obama's presidency. Every single one of these so-called peace process proposals would not have resulted in a sovereign Palestinian state. So when you think about what constitutes a state under international law, and when I think about what constitutes a state under international law, we think about all of the normal things that countries do in the international system. Normal countries control their borders. Normal countries have foreign policies of their own. They can enter into treaties. They can join international organizations. Normal countries have an army and other military forces if they want. I think Costa Rica is the only country in the world that has no military. They make sovereign decisions. Not a single one of these powers, these attributes of sovereignty, would belong to the so-called state of Palestine under the proposals that were put forward, by the way, pre-coordinated by the United States and Israel throughout the entire breadth of the so-called peace process. And what I do in my book, Shattered Hopes, is I document exactly how the Obama administration continued this tradition despite him breaking some new ground in terms of rhetorical sympathy to the plight of the Palestinian people. President Obama was very much complicit in continuing this charade where the United States would coordinate with Israel these unfeasible proposals that would result not in a state for Palestinians, but in a glorified Bantustan. Bantustan is a word that comes to us from the South African political context. When apartheid in South Africa grew to be untenable, when South Africa was sanctioned by the international community, the leaders of apartheid South Africa said, aha, let's try to fool the international community by setting up these Bantustans and appointing to these Bantustans compliant black leaders. They can say they have independent states, but we'll control the borders, we'll control their economies, we'll control their foreign relations, they'll have no army, but at least the international community will be on our back and we'll rid ourselves of these black South Africans so that we can control the vast majority of the land, 90% of it, under the Bantustan proposals. The Bantustans didn't fool anybody. And even though there were compliant leaders that were found to administer the Bantustans for a decade, eventually the whole scheme crumbled, apartheid crumbled, resulting in a transition to a multi-party, multi-ethnic, multi-racial democracy in South Africa. The U.S.-Israeli plan for the so-called Palestinian state, under Bill Clinton, under George Bush, and under Barack Obama, was to have different Bantustans in the West Bank with another Bantustan in the Gaza Strip, where Israel would annex the choicest land, keep many access roads and military bases, having a permanent presence in the Jordan Valley, so that this so-called state of Palestine would not be able to control its borders, would not be able to control its airspace. Israel would get to decide when a plane could come in or out of the state of Palestine, if this so-called state were even allowed to have an airport in the first place. Israel would even keep control over what's called the electromagnetic sphere under all of these plans. Now, I'm not a scientific person, and I had to look up what electromagnetic meant. Maybe some of you all are more familiar with that if you have a scientific background, but it refers to things like cell phone signals and radio wavelengths and so forth. Even under this scheme, Palestinians would not even be able to control their own cell phone signals. Israel would control it.
Their own water.
And their own water as well. Not to mention the fact that Palestinians would have no toehold, no sovereignty in Jerusalem under any of these plans. So when Netanyahu talks about a state minus for the Palestinians, he's only telling the truth about what the last 25 years have been premised on. And as Palestinians have demonstrated time and again, they're not going to accept a proposal for a state minus. Now, I also say that the two-state paradigm is coming to an end because the United States has recognized this as well. When John Kerry became Secretary of State in 2013, at the start of President Obama's second term, he testified before Congress that there existed a 1 to 2 year